Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Justin, and in this episode of the podcast, we're chatting with our dear friend, public historian Codie Eash. Codie currently works as Director of Education and Interpretation at the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. If you've never been to Gettysburg, or if you've been to Gettysburg but have never been to this excellent museum, you need to correct that either on your first visit or on your next visit.
Codie is one of the finest public historians we know, and someone who I've had many discussions with over the years that I've known him about public history, the craft of working in education and museums, and the unique challenges that come with public history work at a Civil War history site. In this episode, we'll explore Codie's work at Seminary Ridge Museum, his background as a one-time journalism major, and his thoughts about how we interpret and talk about Civil War history with audiences like you'll find traipsing across the Gettysburg battlefield.
If you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to rate and review the podcast. That always helps folks find it.
So let's dive into our conversation with Codie Eash. All right, everyone, we are here with Codie Eash, who is our interview subject today. Codie is the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Codie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so we are just excited about this conversation. I have to say, in many years of working together alongside Codie in various different capacities, whether through museum work, through blogging online, through recording Facebook Live videos together and podcasts, we have never done something quite like this. So this is really our goal for this conversation today is to take some public history conversations that we've been having about how we got into public history, how public history is applied to a Civil War site like Seminary Ridge Museum and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and some real kind of philosophical conversations about these topics, and really just kind of give you an inside look at some of the conversations that public historians like the three of us have when we're off the clock, having a beer, driving to a NASCAR race, hanging out and talking about our work. So our goal for today's conversation is to be really conversational and just kind of have some fun with this and give you guys an inside look into how we discuss public history and at Civil War history sites and some of the work that we do all together. But for our listeners, Codie, if you could just give an overview for those that have not been to Seminary Ridge Museum at Gettysburg, could you give us a little bit of an insight into what a visitor would expect to see there and some of the programs and things that you do there at the site?
Yeah, certainly. And I was going to say, Jake, before you did that, yeah, I think some of our deepest conversations have probably come in the car on the way to and from racetracks. So I think that was your initial invitation to me was just that exact scenario this past summer. But certainly, Seminary Ridge Museum is located in the original building on the campus of what is today United Lutheran Seminary. Historically, was the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. The institution itself, the seminary, came to town in 1826 and constructed its first permanent building in 1832 on the western side of town. And that's the building that now houses our museum. The sort of kernel of the museum project dates back to 1999. So this is at the tail end of a decade that had really opened with the big trio of the movie Glory, Ken Burns' Civil War documentary series, and the movie Gettysburg, which sees a spike in Civil War tourism. And by the end of that decade, the 1990s, Seminary Ridge Historic Preservation Foundation is formed on the campus of the Lutheran Seminary with a plan to ultimately turn historic Schmucker Hall, named for the founder of the seminary, Samuel Simon Schmucker, to turn it into a first-class Civil War museum. And the goal ultimately is to do that by 2013. And so we opened that year on July 1st, the 150th anniversary of the battle. The museum tackles three major topics that all really tie into the story of the building, which, as we like to say, is our largest artifact. The end of the first floor introductory film has this great line. I've always thought it was an excellent way to phrase this, which is some items of the past you can hold in your hands, others you can walk inside. And so this now 192, nearly 193-year-old structure houses these stories and these artifacts that we have the opportunity to talk about and interpret. And those stories include an entire floor on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863, easily the most overlooked of the three. It doesn't have so many of those major battlefield landmarks that are associated with the second and third days of battle. And so this is something that over the past couple of decades has gotten more of its due credit, but we have an entire, just about a third of our museum dedicated to that topic, including the story of the famous cupola at the top of the building, most famously used by General John Buford, and visitors can take a guided tour up into the cupola for that truly historic view. We have a whole floor dedicated to a subject I know that throughout Jake's career has been near and dear to his heart, that of Civil War medicine. Specifically, we talk there about the story of the Seminary Hospital, which for about 2.5 months, from July 1st until September 16th, 1863, is one of the longest serving hospitals on the Gettysburg battlefield and appears as likely the very first hospital on the battlefield. Probably the only location that started as an aid station, becomes a field hospital, and ultimately ends up as a general hospital. With about 500 identified patients we have so far, we know that there were upward of 700 there. It's about 90% United States soldiers, about 10% Confederates, including a couple of Confederate generals. And then the second floor is the I think probably most unique story that we tell when it comes to Civil War site interpretation, and that is the story of religion in the context of the Lutheran Seminary. And we tie that into the story of race in Gettysburg and Adams County, really taking these major national issues of churches tearing apart, of sectionalism, of slavery and emancipation, the Underground Railroad and slave catching, and we boil that down to look at how these national debates are playing out literally within the walls of the building that folks are touring. And so what we like to say is it began here, an unforgettable Gettysburg experience begins here too. And that it began here is intentionally vague because it can be interpreted in those many different ways. The it can be the story of the battle that began here, the story of the first hospital on the battlefield that began here, and that story of these national debates playing out within the walls of this building that ultimately lead to the beginnings of the Civil War.
And Cody, you said something there that I thought was great, and actually was going to be the question I had, which is you mentioned that the building itself is the largest artifact that you guys have. Being such a memorable part of the battle, I mean, anybody who's seen the movie Gettysburg and also its role in kind of the first day, does that allow you more flexibility, or what are the pros and cons, I guess, for working somewhere like Seminary Ridge Museum, which is you have this very, very tied in, hey, they were exactly right here, and he stood here and looked that way. Most places don't get that. How does that kind of let you differ than most of the other places in town?
That's an excellent question. On the one hand, certainly I can see that there would be this inclination, as I think there probably was for us just institutionally for quite some time, which is that feeling that you couldn't broaden out beyond the specific stories that are told right there. But when the way that I've taken this and my predecessor in basically the same role that I am now was Pete Mealy, who was then our executive director up until June of 2024 of this year. I think the two of us together, sort of back to back, began to realize that as far as an interpretive and educational plan, these are the basics of what we can talk about, but we can really tie in anything we're interpreting and educating the public about to anything even tangentially related. So don't just tell the story of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Use that as your window to talk about under-recognized aspects of military history overall. And where we've especially taken that is to the story of the soldier experience and even the veteran experience in many cases. And then don't just focus on, the battlefield medicine story, the Civil War medicine story, but tell the story of how this specific place is quite unique and an untapped resource. And you can also broaden that out to, okay, well, what happens to these wounded soldiers once they leave this hospital? They go to any number of places, whether it's a big city hospital like in Philadelphia or down the road in York, or they're taken as prisoners of war to Elmira. We can really, we can tell the story of almost any place that's connected to any of the patients. And we have 493 identified of those stories. So that's really infinite material. And Caleb Kazmierczyk, our current director of museum operations, which up until a few months ago was part of my position as well. I was education and museum operations. But he has really taken on that interpretive piece through a series that he's doing, which is focusing on the wounded who were in the seminary hospital, and he does these sort of 45-minute talks just on these specific soldiers. And that's infinite, and as are the number of the hundreds of medical personnel who are there, both civilians and military, nurses and surgeons, and all the people who are there during the battle and in its aftermath. And then really that story of race and religion allows us better than anywhere on the battlefield to talk about not just what happens 1861 to 1865, but really to tell that bigger, broader story. And certainly there are places like Gettysburg National Military Park, at the Museum and Visitor Center, that are able to tell that full story of the Civil War. But in our case, we can use a rather intimate lens through which to introduce folks and then expand that story out beyond the space where we're standing, and can tie together that sense of place with those bigger trends of the entire era. And we have a story that really goes all the way from 1826 until the end of Reconstruction, but in fact goes well beyond that. We have the final exhibit that people visit. It asks the question, adopting the line from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, what do you think is the unfinished work for freedom? And it's a talkback board where people put up Post-it notes. And so that's tying it literally up to the present day, as they're standing next to a mural that goes from Civil War to civil rights and beyond up until the relative present. The other thing too that makes our site quite unique in its circumstance is back to that piece I mentioned about museum operations. Many of my days, to a lesser degree now, but up until my title change, were spent, I could be doing an educational program for middle schoolers in the morning and then meeting with the alarm company in the afternoon to address an ongoing issue, and then scheduling a special cleaning appointment for an upcoming event. And there are all of these facets of being on a small museum staff in such a historic, iconic place, that we're all wearing many hats, which I know is the theme of many of your conversations on this show, is how much public historians and museum professionals are doing so many different tasks. And in our case, our greatest asset is that we're in an 192, 193-year-old building. And on many days, our greatest downfall is that we're in a 192, 193-year-old building, because it's a porous structure. It has now a decade plus on its tread, if you will, of the systems that were put in even in 2012, 2013 when the museum opened. And so we're seeing more things like, hey, we're going to have to do an overhaul to our audio video system here at some point. But also just this year, we had to do an overhaul to the fire suppression system. And all these little things that when you're thinking about public history and working in a museum field may not always immediately come to mind. You're thinking of just the historical pieces and working with the public and doing research and maybe an artifact rotation. But when you're in especially a operations role, and especially when you're in a building of this age, there are all these other maintenance and structural concerns to consider as well.
That's something I know a lot about as well, having experienced kind of similar working in a building from 1832 when I was at National Museum of Civil War Medicine. That the structure that you're in can provide a lot of challenges, but also a lot of unique interpretive opportunities that you can't get literally anywhere else in the world.
Yep.
And it really is an amazing place. That sense of place is such an important part of Seminary Ridge Museum. And I want to get to that with this next question, which goes back to something you were talking about with when it gets to slavery, race, even medical history as well. Visitors, when they come to Gettysburg, expect, I've noticed, and I'm sure that this is probably, Codie, you know this better than any of us. They expect a certain kind of experience when they go to Gettysburg. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of nostalgia for maybe visiting when they were children many decades ago, that they're going to get a military history experience. They're going to learn about the battle. They're going to learn about where so-and-so regiment was, or this colonel or that general. How has in the decade plus that the museum has been open and you've had these different themes, talking about slavery, race, medical history, the coming of the war, and that looking at that from a hyper local focus of the seminary. What's been the public reaction to that? And has that evolved over time? I know that's probably a pretty big question, but I'm really curious about how your audience responds and what they tell you about those interpretive themes that they see within the museum and your programming.
When I started as an intern in the fall of 2012. This is just for some context here on seeing the shift over time. Other than a couple of volunteers we have, I'm the lone link back to the origins of the museum itself. And that is to say that when I started as a communications intern and then a part-time visitor services assistant, I was able to sort of see how things were structured and why they were designed the way that they are. But I wasn't myself part of that system. But how I've sort of always interpreted how they designed the museum was to draw people in with the story of, as you're talking about, Jake, that what you're expecting when you visit a battlefield, especially a iconic one like Gettysburg, is to draw people in with that familiar story. On the pictures that you have outside, put a soldier. When you come into the museum, we recommend you start at the fourth floor. That's the story of the battle. We're drawing you in with the familiar piece. Even if you don't know a lot about it, even if you have no idea what you're about to experience, the first things you're encountering are, oh yeah, I'm on the first day's battlefield. Of course, I'm going to see John Reynolds and John Buford and 151st Pennsylvania. You're going to see all of those things that are expected. But then you go down to the third floor, and that's where chronologically we're moving from the story of the first day of the battle naturally, historically, into the origins of the seminary hospital. That's what happened to this place after the first day of the battle. But you're sort of getting this added interpretation. How I've always taken it is we start with the what happened, which is the Battle of Gettysburg. And then we go into what it led to. This is its impact on the human body. This is what the 12th bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War, even if there's not a second or a third day of July, this is what July 1st, 1863 does to a couple hundred people in this sample size we have of these 15 or 16,000 people who are maimed collectively on either side. And then you go into the second floor and you're moving from the first day of the battle, to the what happened after, the third floor in the hospital. And now we're looking at why. This is the why it happened. This is why these people were drawn to this battlefield and thousands of others just like it across the American landscape. This is why they're fighting this war, is these bigger issues that are at stake for the fate of this republic, the fate of democracy in America, the fate of human freedom and slavery in America. And I think for the first 2 years, that were open, 2013 to 2015, that's how I think many people took that, interpreted that. Visitors would come in, they'd get the expected things that you would at a typical Civil War museum, and those were their major takeaways. And they might say, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that about medicine. I didn't know that about, that 8% of Gettysburg's population is Black, that the Gettysburg Seminary has one of the first African Americans to study at any postgraduate institution in U.S. history, Daniel Alexander Payne, in 1835. But those sort of peculiarities and those things that were supplemental to the battle story that they were getting. Another major theme of I know many of your shows so far, and a major touch point for all of us, is June of 2015 comes around, and suddenly that entire interpretation, that entire takeaway that people have of what they're experiencing when they visit a Civil War battlefield and a Civil War museum is suddenly changing after the events in Charleston. And there was sort of an added layer to that where our campus, the seminary campus in Gettysburg, had some direct connections to the church, to the minister, to many historic pieces of that story. And it was a big moment for us. I was still at that time on the part-time staff, but saw firsthand, the questions coming in from local and eventually national press. How would museums in Gettysburg handle these issues over the Confederate battle flag? How would we handle these discussions? Suddenly, we have these, memos being talked about, around the staff of, like, this is the email if somebody has an issue with how things are interpreted. But nothing in the museum itself changed, just the way that we answered this and thought about this. And more than any national event that didn't have a direct impact on me, that of the Charleston church shooting is easily that event that ultimately in the long term had the most impact on me as far as events that I have lived through nationally. Of course, we have things like 9/11 that have impacted us all. But in terms of just something that literally changed my day to day, the questions I was receiving, the way I was thinking about history and forced to confront it, there was suddenly a certain amount of people who were visiting who clearly were coming in for no other reason than to go talk to someone who they assumed would either have the same opinion as they did or to ask a prodding question. And sometimes that was for good reason. It was for constructive purposes. But we've all worked in public history. You can sort of read when someone is just sort of looking for a fight, for lack of a better term. And so suddenly we were confronted that in the middle of the battlefield at Gettysburg. And that, came up again in 2017 and in 2020. But long term, all of that collectively, the reckoning that we've had with nationally, how we think about the Civil War and interpret that, that has not let down. We are just as willing, and we do a series called Fridays on the Ridge. Almost none of those. As I think about it, actually, in a year and change that we've done those, I can't think of a single one that was specifically about military history. Every single one of them was either a biography of a soldier or the story of nurses and patients at the seminary hospital. But those left flank, right flank sort of maneuver talks are not what we do, and our supporters and the general public, I think, have come to sort of appreciate a lot of that. And certainly, that we're on a battlefield. We can't forget that what happened there. And so we have walking tours that follow in the footsteps of of units and commanders who were right on Seminary Ridge. We tell those stories as a piece of our story, but we're always looking, no matter what our program is, at the so what. We never lead or conclude with the minutia of military history. Even if we talk a lot about it, there's so much more to it than that. And we really kind of started emphasizing our battle anniversary programming in 2021 and 2022, and it's only grown since then. And we've had a lot of people who have told us, as we've seen our audiences grow, that they really appreciate what we're doing, that we're taking these things that people thought that they understood, as far as, John Buford's or John Reynolds' role in July 1st. But now all of a sudden we're introducing these characters who they weren't familiar with, whether it's Reynolds' staff officers and the interesting lives that they lead, or just the general educational concept of corroborating primary sources. We're not just reading firsthand accounts, but we're handing them to visitors and asking them, okay, you're going to represent person A, you're going to represent person B. We're going to make a miniature map among all of us here so we understand where these people were standing when they were taking part in the events that we're reflecting on. We're going to try to corroborate those. We're going to try to make sense of this concept of historical memory. We're not just going to define history versus memory. We're going to play it out right now. And those sorts of things are how that's the way we interpret military history. But then there's always that social and political aspect that are a heavy emphasis for us. And that's something that was created out of that 2015 to 2020 period that has never subsided. We don't treat it with any sort of, we don't put gloves on and say this is going to be touchy history. We just interpret it and utilize the firsthand accounts of people themselves, and have generally received very little pushback. Every once in a while somebody will, the hackles will be up, but generally speaking, there's more of a, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that controversial opinion was had by insert historical actor here.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, Codie, because it's talk about a growth of a historian, growth of the field. I I disagree with you, because I still would think that all the stories that you can say in the seminary, whether that's the medical story or anything that goes on there, still is military history, right? And that's something that it took me a while in grad school to kind of get up, because and as I'm growing as a historian, as I want to be a Civil War person, yeah, you start off with the box of left flank, right flank, they shot so and so, bullets were here, cannon were there, yada yada yada. But then the peeling back of the onion of, well, okay, yeah, these are all the results of those actions, is what I think that you guys, I think, have the flexibility to do that, right? Because when people come to Gettysburg, they go to the National Park Service, they go to the foundation site, and I think in a way, they are less flexible than you guys are because they have to tell that military history story of the so and so is here. They have to see the Morgan Freeman film. You can't change that because I don't know. It's the spot that everybody kind of starts. It's a driving tour stop one, but I think that's what's great about you guys is you're on the driving tour route and you can be that flexible and talk about the other aspects of military history that I had no idea until I started taking classes in grad school. And I remember thinking the same thing of like, here I took a military history class at WVU and first like 5 or 6 articles we read about, I was doing like medical stuff. I was doing like Reconstruction and how the military did that. And I kind of thought to myself one time, of like, where's the military history in this? And I was like, wait a second, no, yeah, you need to broaden your own viewpoint on it. But if I could tell you, or if you could summarize for me, when you first started the Seminary Ridge Museum to where it is now, where would you see the biggest growth for you, not only in the stories you're telling, but in the museum itself of, and you kind of just answered it, but I'm in your personal aspect of it, is there anything you can say or any anecdote that you have of, hey, when you first started here, this is what you thought your role was, this is what you thought the history that you could tell was, whereas now you're able to talk about things maybe you didn't think about doing before.
Certainly. Well, like when I started and I'm walking in, day one, month before we opened, and we're giving these preview tours for high level donors, we were leading tours from the cupola, as we still do, about half an hour long. And we emphasized right away that this is not a tactical tour. We're not talking left flank, right flank. That's always the go-to phrase everybody uses. But we're not just talking tactics and strategy, but we're telling a story here. But I think back to I don't know that any recordings survive of us, any of us giving those tours that I can recall. There might be a YouTube video or something. But as I think back to it, I think even though we were already aware we didn't want to just be tactical history, I think it's become even less that. We're talking more about things like landscape and topography today than we once did. And then as my role grew, up until about 2017 when I became full time, that was just about the only interpretation I was doing. I'd fill in for an educational program here and there, but by and large, that was the only interpretation I was doing. And I was doing some other things outside of the museum, just on my own, going to libraries or roundtables and talking about other things that interested me, which, as a direct result of 2015, became the story of the long-term aftermath of the Civil War. I became very interested in memory and the veterans' experience and things along those lines and Reconstruction. And so when I was able to now start writing programming on behalf of the museum, which began in earnest in 2020 online and then 2021 going to things like Civil War roundtables and the library, et cetera, it became now, I think, official for our institution that we weren't just talking about these things that were specific to Seminary Ridge, but that almost always began, the introduction was, this is why I, with wearing the logo of Seminary Ridge Museum, this is why I am telling you this story. This is how it fits into this aspect of what we're talking about. And just to give you kind of a good example of that, we're doing a program next month in January for Martin Luther King Day. And I'm going to be doing a program called 5 Years Ago, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Legacy of the Civil War. My introduction is going to be that as my dog is sniffing the, if you hear anything in the background, Pepper is at the other end of the microphone stand here. But that last exhibit that I was talking about with the unfinished work for freedom, one of the pieces of that mural is Martin Luther King giving the I Have a Dream speech and him with Lyndon Johnson as Johnson is signing. I'm not sure if it's the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights of 65, but either way, that's a piece of our exhibit that has always been there. But that, to my knowledge, other than a Facebook post maybe for MLK Day, we've never done anything with that. We've never told the public this is why this is an important piece of our story. And so I'm going to peel back that layer. And that's something that I just don't even know in the overall ether of the Civil War sesquicentennial, which now feels like a totally different world when we look back on 2011 to 2015. I don't even think that we would have considered telling that story. It was like, oh yeah, naturally it's there because that's a long-term effect of the story that we tell. But why would we spend 45 minutes or an hour talking about it when he wasn't here? And so I think that we've gone from the literal, only telling the stories that are specifically here, to now broadening that to, all right, well, using the stories and the people and the themes that are here, what bigger story can we tell? How can we connect the hundreds, thousands of people who have been connected to this place historically? How can we connect those stories to something that matters, not just for people who come into this building, but matters for the entire American story? On the flip side of that, these sound probably like two totally contradictory things. But when it comes to the artifacts that we are displaying, we have gotten much more specific. And we are not a collecting institution. That is, we don't have an artifact collection of our own. Everything we have is on loan from a dozen or so organizations and individuals. And the stories that we tell have gotten broader and bigger, but the pieces we display over time, as more people are familiar with us and we're more familiar with more stories of what happened at our site, we can now display things not just as we did in 2013 that are emblematic of the Civil War, or 2017, let's say, of stories that relate to Gettysburg, but now we've gotten more and more pieces of soldiers who fought right on Seminary Ridge, of surgeons and patients who were right in the seminary hospital. And we're doing an artifact rotation probably late winter or so, going through that process now. And all I'll say is, we have some really, really cool things that we didn't know existed from people who were not even in our orbit until rather recently. And they say, I have this. Would you like to put it on display? And we say, yes, of course. And so our story, it's kind of like a yo-yo. We broaden out. This is the story we tell. This is why it matters, big picture. And then we can zoom way in to say, well, this person's rifle, that's in this case, they were right here. And so we've done both of those things at the same time over time.
I want to go back to the other side of the potentially contradictory points you just made, and go to the stories that you're telling, the programming you're doing. And this is a conversation you and I, Codie, have had a number of times over the years, but especially this summer, thinking about how you deal with preconceived notions, deeply entrenched beliefs, the lost cause among visitors coming to Seminary Ridge. I'm really curious about, and this comes from a previous conversation we had, one of the last conversations of season 1, as we're calling it now, of the podcast, with Evan Kutzler, was this concept of public historians really being on the front lines of these battles that we see about our history that are taking place, whether it's in the political realm, the social realm, online, that you are, Codie, a real historian at a real museum dealing with real visitors. This is not a Facebook comment section. This is not an academic historian giving a lecture to their students or to fellow academic historians. You are right there at the tip of the spear of, you have an interpretation of the Civil War and what happened at Seminary Ridge Museum and at Gettysburg, and a visitor may have an entirely different interpretation of that. How do you deal with that? What are your strategies for negotiating with those visitors and trying to instill some of the historical knowledge that you have and the interpretive pieces that you want to get across?
Yeah, much like Evan said in that conversation, there's a lot of whataboutism. He gave the example of Andersonville, of someone who says, well, what about Elmira? And he said, well, we're not there. We're at Andersonville. I understand where you're coming from, but let's talk about the place where we are. And we get some of that sort of thing. And I think a good example is when we have the story of Samuel Schmucker, the founder of the seminary. He's the president of the institution from 1826 until 1864, and our museum offices are in his wartime home, which was built in 1833. And in the modern parlor of the home, at least a portion of that was Schmucker's office at the time of the battle. And there's a story where in the days leading up to the battle, sometime before June 26th, 1863, he receives word from a former student of his in Frederick County, George Deal. And George Deal warns Schmucker. We don't know how he learned this. We don't know what form his warning took, but he tells Schmucker, get out of Gettysburg. The Confederate Army may be arresting you if they should find you. Schmucker's a controversial figure in the Lutheran Church for a series of sermons that he had published preaching, in his words, universal abolition. There's a heavy Lutheran contingent in South Carolina. There are former students of his who are now in the Confederate Army. They know who he is. There's a rumor that he's using his property as a station in the Underground Railroad, for instance. And so we know that he flees, and we know the Confederate forces, when they take Seminary Ridge, ransack his library. They scatter the contents about the lawn promiscuously, as Schmucker says, in an after the fact. And that's a story that for a lot of people we can utilize if they are bringing in this preconceived notion of, it was just those ventral Yankees who are, destroying property in the South, whether it's the March to the Sea or Fredericksburg in Shenandoah Valley, whatever the case may be. And they want to bring up that, well, what about that? And we say, yes, that doesn't negate that this also happened. Similarly, we have some pieces from the Thaddeus Stevens Society, including a stove that was forged at the Caledonia Iron Works, owned by Stevens. And that ironworks, infamously on June 26th, is burned entirely by Confederate forces. And we can clearly see in newspaper accounts, in Early's own memoir, he tells us the reason why. He tells us it's because Stevens is an abolitionist. And those sorts of talking points, those sorts of stories, no matter how much evidence we present, it makes some people's toes curl. Like it sort of makes them upset that these things happen. It's relatively few and far between at this point. I'll say that we get any sort of pushback of a lengthy or of a serious sort. But there is certainly still that lingering, well, what about this? And how we've handled it is much the way Evan talked about in your conversation is, yeah, that is true. I understand why you're saying that, but let's not discount what I'm saying that happened at this site. And that goes back to that example of, yes, talking about the literal of the site where you are, but then also expanding it beyond that to this broader story. And the other thing too that I've done is I've leaned right into thinking about and talking about topics that could be perceived as controversial. And I phrase it that way after Barb Sanders at Gettysburg National Military Park last summer, as part of the park's Days with Documents program, professional development seminar for teachers. She invited me to do a talk. They came to Seminary Ridge, and the theme of the day was topics that could be perceived as controversial. And I really like that phrasing, not just controversial topics, because that inherently says that these are things that, are dicey to talk about. But saying that broader things that could be perceived as controversial to your audience. And I told the story of Schmucker, told the story of, Confederate flag debates at Seminary Ridge and in Gettysburg during 2015. We have, I think, also this valuable resource, which is the fact that though we don't want to always equate the past to the present and say this is happening again, this happened in the past and we can copy and paste what happened then to now and take that as our lesson. That's not a healthy thing to do. But when someone says, why is it that all of a sudden in 2020 Confederate monuments became controversial, we can say, well, no matter what side of this issue you come down on, I can show you right now a newspaper article from 1891 that shows that there are Union veterans who are fighting to take down the first Confederate monument at Gettysburg. That the first people who opposed Confederate monuments and Confederate flags were not suddenly born out of the 21st century. They were the people who fought against actual Confederates. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they were always right in their tactics or right in their thoughts on these things. That's not the piece that I am trying to convey to someone. But the piece that I will try to convince someone of is the fact that it is important to know that these things did happen, that the Civil War was naturally, by its very nature, a controversial event. And that the ways that we think about the Civil War have always been perceived as controversial on both sides of the issue. It's why we have so many different interpretations of the Civil War and its causes and its legacies. And we go through these cycles, usually at big anniversaries or at moments of a national racial reckoning, where all of a sudden we take a step back and we say, all right, what is it that we can learn from how we do interpret the story of the Civil War, how monuments are displayed at everywhere from national parks to local town squares. What is the role of a Confederate battle flag? And we can point back to the fact that in 1913, for this Grand Peace Jubilee, an event that we always seem to want to look at solely through these nostalgic lenses of, well, they could get back together and shake hands. We should be able to as well. And that's a wonderful notion and a wonderful ideal. But there are also, it's equally true that Union veterans are threatening to not come if Confederate veterans are allowed to bring their flags, and Confederate veterans are threatening to not come if they're not allowed to bring their own flags. And so using the template of the past, the things that have definitely already happened in a certain way, and saying this isn't the first time we're having this conversation, that is a way that I think does disarm a lot of people who come in with hardened opinions. And I think that distinction that you made, Jake, of, this isn't a comment thread, this isn't a chat forum, this is literally people in the flesh who are coming to your site, have a preconceived notion, may want to debate about something. Almost always, in my experience, we can dispel a myth, we can come to a conclusion, a consensus of that person leaving and saying, "Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Thank you for imparting that," versus the loggerheads that we oftentimes have online.
And Cody, Jake's comment about, being on the front lines of it too. That's what I think about, at least for me, the difference between pre-2015 to now. And we can, I guess, take this to your kind of personal as you were growing up. Did you ever envision yourself as this historian being on the front lines of this reckoning with the American kind of public and this reckoning with American memory? I don't want to put the answer in your mouth, but for me, right, I was like, oh, Civil War, growing up as a kid, there's these nerds over here in the corner that really care about it, but let's just leave it to the nerds, right? Well, here we are in 2015, 2016, being at the center of kind of this, I don't know if you call it growth, but this, I guess reckoning is the right word for it, right? Of America, not only, with its view of Confederate kind of iconography, but also what it wants to be, right? So I guess from that, I don't know where the question is there, Jake. Maybe we could take it back to your personal kind of growing up, Cody. But that's what I think you just articulated very well, is that I don't know. It's being on the front line. It kind of is fun because it's unlike a whole lot of other professions in the history field. You can talk about medieval history. You can talk about even World War II history. And right now, I don't think there's anybody pushing back for World War II history now. Now, I wonder 15, 20, 30 years from now, when we get kind of more perspective, what that's going to look like. But it kind of is unique that if you do study history, if you are a public historian, no one's going to come for you about the War of the Roses and have very strong opinions about the War of the Roses. So it kind of makes you learn on the fly that you have to be, you got to kind of be concise, and you have to kind of articulate things. I'm not going to say dumb it down, because I think that's not doing it. I think you have to be able to explain very, very complex things to people, like you said, who maybe there for an argument, or maybe just be curious and have no idea. So I think that's what's kind of unique, not only with you're about the Seminary Ridge Museum, but being in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, I think offers that unique ability that I feel like most places around the country don't have.
Yeah, no doubt. I think I've often wondered, and I've talked with friends in the public history field as well, about the difference between working at Gettysburg versus working at a seldom visited Civil War site, where you're still talking about the Civil War, but most people who are visiting, a smaller battlefield, let's just say in Tennessee, they're probably, not going to, because it's not as A, commercialized, B, as written about. There's this Gettysburg is its own animal, where you have everything can be perceived as controversial, from the social issues that we're still dealing with today, going back to that tactical issue. People really do get upset if you say that the left flank of a unit was at that rock, and someone else says, no, I read a source that it was at that barn. Chris Gwynn at Gettysburg National Military Park, he has this phrase that I've often appropriated, which is, Gettysburg is a battle of superlatives. every veteran and every, many visitors today, they want to know who fired the first shot, who advanced the furthest, who held out the longest, who retreated last. These are concerns that are had at Gettysburg that are had at almost no other site. So you have that piece of it. Just the Gettysburg as its own strange place in that regard. But then you also have it being this national epicenter all the way back to 1863, 64. It has always been this national epicenter of Civil War tourism. And so anything that anybody has thoughts on about the Civil War, then or now, military or social, whatever it might be, they're going to bring that thought with them to Gettysburg. And I would say the most sort of benevolent version of this is just myth busting. It's the stuff about history, Civil War history and Gettysburg history that people have always thought. And you have to be that sort of bearer of bad news, if you will, that, well, I know why you think this. 50% of the people who visit here think this, but it's not true. And here's why. And it's always having that understanding view. I think that that's something that is so lacking just in how we have conversations today, is just that sense of empathy, of understanding why someone came from the position that they are, even if you absolutely disagree with them on a fundamental level, whether a political level, moral level, in this case a historical level. There's something gained if you can at least say, before disagreeing with them or disputing them, if you can say, I get why you think the way that you do, but let me give you something that contradicts that. And so yeah, there are just these multiple facets of Gettysburg, all these layers that make it the truly unique place that it is. And I guess the last anecdote that I'll give to emphasize that point is, I was with our director of outreach, Rob Williams, at the National Council for Social Studies in Philadelphia, or at the Philadelphia Convention Center. This is 2022. And as we're in the exhibit hall, we're walking around and looking around, and we see that there are several cities that have multiple museums. There are multiple Washington, D.C. museums. There are multiple Philadelphia museums, multiple New York City museums, multiple Boston museums. The only place that had multiple museums or organizations represented that is not a major city that I could tell is Gettysburg. And that speaks to the significance of the place as a town today that has maybe 4 times the population it did in 1863, 3 to 4 times. It's like 8,000 residents today. Very small compared to any of those other places that I just listed. And at that, it takes on this role of being, if you're going to visit any Civil War site in the United States, whether you're an international visitor or you're an American, it's probably going to be Gettysburg, is that one place you're going to visit for that story. And so the entire 4-year conflict, and at that, I think we could say the entire 5 decades that constitute the Civil War era, are all boiled down to this place where 3 days of that conflict happened. And at that, people are visiting for 3 days and 2 nights, perhaps in most cases, for a weekend trip. And so there are just so many layers of that we have to sort of try to peel back, and that's all the way from the things that can be perceived as controversial to just the things that are just misconceived. I don't know if I answered I forget what your original question was there. Sorry, I got on a
No,
on
it
a
was good.
tangent.
I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, that's a fact. It's actually really good. I never thought about that before, because you're right? Like, Gettysburg has, on my count, at least 3 major, sometimes if you want to say 4 or 5, if you're counting some part-time sites of, I mean, national level museums. Like, what you guys do on a national level is unique, and there's 3 other places that also are on that same par, which I think is really good. I mean, yeah, I had never thought about that before. That's interesting.
Yeah. And I guess to your part too, Justin, I just considered about, did I ever consider the fact that, we're on the front lines of that, of trying to help Americans cope with that reckoning. In so many words, yeah, I have considered that. And I've also thought about the fact that this is sort of an abstract thought, but anybody who's in Civil War history, especially since or during that 2015 to 2020 period, became ourselves a piece of that history, not just the interpreters of it, but we became a piece of that, because there was a major shift there at that point in time in how we wanted the public to think about the Civil War and its long-term consequences. And in so doing, when we look back on that in decades and centuries to come, that will be a major period is going to be how National Park Service sites and public historians, and to a degree, back to your point, Jake, a lot of social media historians and things of that sort will look back on that in terms of some individuals certainly who will stick out, but then also just the tactics that were used, the strategies that were used to tell history in a different way and engage it from the historical standpoint, but then also in some of those cases from more of an activist sort of standpoint. And how I sort of always saw myself in that realm, even outside of what I do at Seminary Ridge. I'm not as active most of the history I do is for work now. But before I had the opportunities that I do in my day job, I was pretty active on social media, excuse me, especially on Facebook, and really was looking for those stories that could be perceived as controversial, and almost never imparting my own opinion on these matters, but would just put up a quote from a monument dedication speech, from a Frederick Douglass writing, things like that really made that connection from the past to the present, where it was that classic, maybe cliche, but nevertheless it works, that example of it's almost like that person who's writing that in 1867, let's say, it's almost like they were writing that in the summer of 2017, because it just fits so well with the debates that were still happening. And the way that I've always stated this is so many of the debates we're still having over the Civil War are a result of the unfinished conversations of what veterans and the people who lived through that era, try as they might, they couldn't come to a consensus or a conclusion on how to resolve so many of those conversations, and those are the debates we're having now.
I have to say, going back to your social media posts back in that time frame that you were just discussing, I learned so much from those about Gettysburg, but also about how the veterans really thought about the memorialization of Gettysburg's memory, Civil War memory in general. It's really, I feel like that's the moment too when we started to collaborate with Pennsylvania in the Civil War.
Yeah.
That we debuted in 2019. You can see that at penncivilwar.com and go back through some of the things that we wrote about. And Codie wrote a lot about this, about memorialization, and some of these quotes you were able to share with a little more context of why the things that were said during monument dedications, why they were said at that time, things that resonated in the 21st century with us because they were having the same debates, that they were having these conversations. It really, I just want to thank you for sharing that research. It really helped for me to really develop an interest in this understanding of the long-standing kind of ramifications of the Civil War in a way that I had never thought about it before. It was really that relevancy of our own current moment, that and you sharing that history again, without, I think this is something that you do so well. This is now becoming the Codie Eash celebration podcast. Is that you share things without that opinion, without that. I think so much of the problem with online history and what we see from, I think you said, social media historians, and I've fallen into this trap in the past myself. I've tried to learn the lesson from you, and from others that do this well, is that you don't need to add that your opinion about this. And that's something that I would view as what's wrong with America in the moment, is that everybody's a pundit. We're going to go back to Evan Kutzler's conversation from season 1. Everyone's a pundit. And what you were doing and you do with your interpretation now at Seminary Ridge Museum too, is just let the historical figures speak for themselves, provide the context, show, don't tell, that these conversations they're relevant to us today, but they mirror what was going on in the past, and it's still a part of this really healing process of the turmoil of the Civil War that we've never really grappled with. So I don't really know where to go from there, other than, I don't know if you have another comment on that, Codie or Justin.
I was going to say, I think that that's where public history and that's where sites have a unique ability is because we try to not be the pundit and tell them what to believe, but make them think, right? And
Mhm.
there's very few places I think people are forced to think nowadays. A lot of places they go to, whether that's their news or whatever, they're told a particular slant and they can tune in to whatever news channel they want to get what they want to believe. And there's a very few places that are making them think about what their own thoughts were. So, Codie, going back to your kind of comments on how being able to be there on the front lines and people being there, I mean, you are very few places around the country or very few places in people's lives today, maybe making people think that I don't think they are doing otherwise, right? I mean, I've been out of the public history game for a little while now, but you could see that in the visitors who would come in, right? They would come in, you would tell them a story, and then they were kind of like walking around the rest of the site, not aloof, but kind of like, wow, I guess didn't really think about it that way. Like
Mhm.
you're challenging them in ways that I don't think they have been challenged in a very long time, just because the rest of society is able to feed them, what they want to believe, and they're able to look up exactly what they want to believe, whether that stuff is true or not. So I just think that Jake, you brought up the good point there of, making people think I think. That's a mouthful. Is something that I think public historians are able to do better than others because of, yeah, you can present the facts, you can present the quotes, and then it's like you let it go out in the air and you can start to see the gears turning a little bit when you kind of lay that, one liner on them of, and so thought this, and I'm just going to get out of the way and let that person from 150 years ago continue to tell their story. We're just the messengers. We're not the people who kind of influence that. So,
Well,
I
I appreciate that. I'll just say I really appreciate the kind words. That does mean a lot. And just as an anecdote, I'll say this as humbly as I can because I hate talking about myself, but especially in a laudatory way. But it became quite strange to me in the best possible way. It was humbling that it was as a result of those things that all of a sudden you start to see first the social media numbers grow, especially during COVID, and you're like, okay, this is the only way I can convey this history to people. But then you start to see people who are coming into the museum and they're like, "Oh, no way, you're Codie." And or I'm at a conference and people are recognizing me. And it's just so crazy to think that because on on the one hand, when I started at Seminary Ridge Museum, I wasn't even really looking for a career, I didn't think, in history. I don't even know, and I know this is a few people have said this on your show before. I don't even know if I fully understood or knew the term public history when I started in working in public history. Much like you, Jake, I have a journalism background, and started as a communication assistant was my internship. Then I was just sort of a front end guy. I always had an interest in history. Started at Shippensburg University in secondary education social studies. Quickly learned I didn't really want to teach. I didn't think I did, but journalism was calling me more and more. And so, as fate had it, the moment that I made the jump, switched departments, it was literally like the next day. There was a posting on the wall of the journalism building at Shippensburg for this new forthcoming Seminary Ridge Museum. They were looking for a communications assistant, someone with PR background, journalistic background, web design background. And so that was sort of my back door back into the history field. And then fast forward just a little less than 3 years later, and I realized that I'm on the one of many on the front lines of this national debate over how we think about the Civil War today. And then fast forward a few years after that, and I'm finding my own unique lens that certainly builds upon the work of going back to David Blight and Carolyn Janney and Keith Harris and all these people who have written these big picture books about Civil War memory. And then suddenly I'm gaining traction personally and then professionally, and people are recognizing me and inviting me to speak at further places and end up in communication with David Blight. And I'm mentioned in the footnotes of a book that wins the Pulitzer Prize. Like it's like how in the world in a really short period did I get there? Did I get to a point where it seems that some people, in the grand scheme of a small audience, of course, um, are looking at me in sort of the same lens that I look at a lot of people who I've read and appreciate as historians and interpreters. But I think I've always stayed grounded in that sort of journalistic background, which is one of the things that's so heartbreaking about how how little trust there is in the press today, is that when journalism is at its best is the same thing as when history is at its best, is it allows you to think and to ponder these bigger things about it, what it means to be an American and a citizen and just a person, and how to deal with these sources that you're reading, of course, to make your own opinion, but to take what you're reading and what you're hearing from someone who you trust, who may be giving you information that you don't like to hear or don't want to hear, but you're still trusting that that information is accurate. And that's the thing that I think I have come to realize that gives me some hope, despite living through, some pretty dark times recently. That gives me some hope is that line of thinking, the truly vitriolic rhetoric that we see, is mostly online. But in the cases when it is anywhere from a dozen to 100 people in a space, all learning together, having a Q&A session together, hearing a lecture or presentation together, it's few and far between that there's actually any real controversy that comes up. And I think the moment that I really realized, like, okay, I really got somewhere with that style of presenting is when a Civil War roundtable in Virginia, in southwestern Virginia, invited me to talk about the first attempt at a blue-gray reunion in 1869. After I told them, this is not like the other blue-gray reunions. This is a blue-gray reunion where there was still a lot of hate between the two sides, where there are some quotes from prominent figures that many people in the South probably might take umbrage with, and they still said, that's okay. That's what we want to hear. And in the Q&A session, some people tried to push back, but ultimately I had established a rapport. I had established a level of trust that they're hearing things from these titans of Southern and Confederate history that they didn't expect to hear, and vice versa. And looking at Gettysburg in a way that they don't want to look at Gettysburg and the veteran experience. And despite them not liking that these things were true, they were accepting that they were. And I think that was a sign of, okay, yeah, I got somewhere with this style of presenting and researching.
I think that is a good spot for us to leave the interview portion today, Codie. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your opinions, your methodology, your work, your background. This has been great. I do think we only worked through a portion of our questions that we had, so I think there might be a future
Be happy to.
conversation to have.
Part two, the extended version.
The director's cut.
Sorry if the long answers got us there to that point, but yeah, I'd be happy to come back. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. We're going to move over to our postscript section of the podcast. This is the section of the show where we share something from the last week or a little longer that's left an impression on us that we want to share. It could be a book, an article, a movie, or an experience that we had. It's something that we want to remember and share with the audience. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Mr. Voigthofer, for your postscript for this episode.
Yeah, mine's an interesting one. It's kind of the appeal of, I guess, history is never static. There's always new things you can do with it, and what you can do with it is pretty powerful. This story is about a decade old now, but I just came across it. I may have talked about this group before. There's a group doing YouTube kind of battlefield tours called Battle Guide. Would highly recommend visiting their YouTube page. They do a lot of really cool stuff with new innovative techniques, whether that's Google Earth or being able to look at things in a more visual way than past. Kind of makes battles and maps and stuff jump off the page. It was about a 25-minute YouTube video about Richard III and how back in 2012 they ended up finding, and this is the last king of England to die in battle, found him buried underneath a parking lot in outside of Leicester in England. And it was fascinating to me because the whole thing talks about how for the longest amount of time, for 400 years, people thought the battle was in one location and occurred in this little area outside of Leicester. And due to modern archaeology, they were able to basically pick the battlefield up and move it. I don't know the distance, but it seemed like 200-300 yards, because at that time battles are not the biggest things. to where it actually occurred at. And then from that, using firsthand accounts of the battle that are 500 years old, they kind of determined where they thought that an old church or an old kind of friary was built. They didn't really know. And this is, I guess, kudos to the town council for letting this happen, because I often think about my hometown. If I were to go to them and say, hey, there's an off chance that some old king may be buried here. We have to dig 3 ditches. They might be in this location. We don't know. Good for that town council to get the buy-in, because literally the first dig, they go down, they tear up a parking lot, not only a parking lot, the city council parking lot, and they find the first very dig, they find a leg bone. And they think, okay, there's no way, we'll put this back in the ground and we'll continue going. And due to the other 3 kind of trenches that they dug, they found out that where they thought they dug the first time in this old building that is obviously been built over 500 years, was in the exact spot that the last king of England to die in battle was buried at. So they were able to exhume his body. They did DNA testing to prove that it was in fact him with a distant kind of relative down the line. And then what I thought was the best part was, due to the wounds received from the skeletal kind of gashes and different parts that were damaged, they now know exactly how he, or at least the injuries that he suffered in his final moments before he passed away, which is, blunt force trauma to the head. They talked about how there's a stab wound in like the pelvic area. So they think, and the accounts back this up, that they kind of threw him over a horse and ran him into town. They stripped him off of all of his armor and embarrassment, like threw him on a horse and ran him into town. Somebody must have stabbed him like in the right buttocks, because like the pelvic kind of area there had a wound on it. And I was like, that's kind of personal, man. That kind of sucks. But it kind of brought it like a human nature to the, why would I care about a 500-year-old king? But here I am like, wow, that kind of sucks for that guy. Now, granted, he was an awful person, apparently. This is not my realm of history. Please do not come after me in the comments. I'm basing this off of just William Shakespeare. But Jake's, wagging his finger at me. So I don't know if I'm doing a disservice to Richard III or if I'm painting him as a bad guy. But anyway, I just thought it was a crazy medium. Here I am in the United States. I've never been to Leicester. I've never been to England before in my life. And I'm getting into like these nitty gritty aspects of the town council getting buy-in and this cool kind of GIS kind of view of this battle that happened 500 years ago. So highly recommend Battle Guide. Highly recommend going on their YouTube page. You're going to be down a rabbit hole if you're like me. And kind of going into what you said, Cody. Here I am looking at kind of DNA testing and 500-year ago military medicine, and the different wounds and stuff that they kind of dealt with back then. So thought it was fascinating. Did not expect that. I was just laying on the couch before I went to sleep, and for whatever reason, it popped in my YouTube algorithm of like, hey, you should view this. And I viewed it, and before I knew it, I was like, oh, cool. Now I need to nerd out on Richard III. So that's my postscript.
I have a follow up to that. So
boy.
I went down. This is not my time period in history at all, but I do have a tendency to rabbit hole on things that I find after watching videos like you did. I will say, so there's a great movie that came out 2 years ago, or in 2022, called The Lost King, which is the story of the woman who leads the effort to discover the remains that were rumored to be potentially in the vicinity of that church, where he was buried. But it's a really interesting movie. It's not the best movie, but it's pretty good. But I was wagging my finger at Justin because going into this idea of Richard III as this kind of evil, monstrous person, it gets into a bit of like kind of a little bit of memory studies, and how memory of historical figures or time periods can be warped on purpose for political purposes. And that is that the Tudors, who are those that kill Richard III and take power in after him, they very intentionally play up these stories of Richard III as this monstrous figure, which they do prove. The bones do show that he had a form of scoliosis, which this kind of, he's portrayed as this evil hunchback in Shakespeare who is of the Tudor time period. I even remember I had a medievalist at Hood College who taught kind of the methodology of history course, and we actually read a novel that was about researching Richard III, and who the real historical figure was. And it was a novel, but it showed the process of how you need to evaluate your sources and understanding the source material. So I would just add that it's a little more
So
murky.
you're telling me there's a lost cause of Richard III that now I'm going to have to kind of study?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is a and it goes totally the other direction too. So there's like a Richard III Society, of which this woman who leads the effort to dig him up, they find the remains in the car park in Leicester. That she is like, she and her crew, they're like hardcore, like Richard III was the best person and the best king of England that ever existed. So it goes way in the other direction as well. And as we know, and as good public historians, the truth is always typically somewhere in the middle, between these things. So, but I will say, I'm glad you went down that little bit of rabbit hole, Justin. I would say for you and for listeners, this is a rabbit hole worth going down further because it's a really, really interesting story.
Gosh, now I'm just going to become a medievalist and I'm going to hate it.
All right, so Cody, what will your postscript be this episode?
Well, I will definitely have to check out that YouTube channel, Justin. I was not familiar, but that sounds fascinating, and I am a big fan of rabbit holes. My postscript deals with another type of king, and was directly influenced by you, Jake, and that is the HBO documentary that came out in 2018 called King in the Wilderness. Jake had recommended it, I don't know, a month or so ago to me. And I watched it probably a little more than a week ago, but it was within the past 2 weeks. And easily one of the greatest documentaries that I think I've ever seen. Just absolutely fascinating, about the last roughly 3 years of King's life, where he's really taking on, from about 1965, after the voting rights passes, is taking on these three fights that he has taken up the mantle on, and that is against obviously racism and segregation, but also the war on poverty and opposing the war in Vietnam. And it goes up until the time of his assassination, and all of the talking heads are people who personally knew Martin Luther King. And we are, as a direct result of that, we were going to be showing a film the weekend of Martin Luther King Day at Seminary Ridge, and it was to be determined. But after seeing that, we decided that was going to be the film that we are showing. So Sunday, January 19th, if anybody is in Gettysburg, come by, free to the public, at 1 o'clock. We're going to be showing King in the Wilderness, and this ties into what's going to be sort of my big winter project now. I finished up my first semester with our mutual friend Rich Condon in the same program as well. Our first semester at Gettysburg College and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, our master's in American History program. And now that I have about 2 months until our next semester starts, it's mostly a work project. It's going to be this King research for the talk that I mentioned earlier about King and the legacy of the Civil War. But I have now become extraordinarily interested in the civil rights era and reading the Taylor Branch books now for the winter of America in the King years. And so this has become, I think, my next area of study that I am not as knowledgeable about in yet as I feel I should be, but ties into what we talked about earlier, those long-term consequences of the Civil War. And especially I'm looking at the ways that King is referencing in his own writings and speeches, when he's talking about slavery and the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln and John Brown and Frederick Douglass and Reconstruction. And when I asked Jake about, have you ever done any research into this realm? What do you recommend? And one of Jake's first recommendations was King in the Wilderness, and absolutely phenomenal documentary that I can't highly recommend enough. And thank you, Jake, for the recommendation.
Absolutely. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I'm really glad you're going to be showing the film. I think my experience having watched it was really kind of the same, diving into the literature of the civil rights movement, trying to get a better idea of who King was. It provides a lot of great inspiration to go back and read more about him. I think my biggest takeaway, and I'm curious, Cody, if you had the same thought, was just how hated a figure he had become,
Yep.
by the time you get to his assassination. And it really it kind of irks me, I will say, to see just how much certain sectors of American society today, on the one hand, laud Martin Luther King as the, I have a dream speech, and his efforts in the earlier stages of the civil rights movement, that never have zero awareness or are entirely blind to the other positions he took about income inequality, about housing discrimination that took place, about racism in America, that made him extremely controversial in the later stages of the 1960s up to the time of his assassination. And it really gave me it made me a little angry, I will say, just to see how he is celebrated by people who today, by people who have no understanding of what his full message was, and who don't understand fully what he stood for, and have very, very contrary opinions, and policy positions to what King stood for, in the last stages of his life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's fighting, obviously, in many ways, different issues than the figure I'm about to say. But as a student of Frederick Douglass, I can't help but see that there are many parallels. Douglass post-Reconstruction to about the end of his life, as David Blight talks about in his biography of him, Prophet of Freedom. He talks about how Douglass was sort of this outside figure who became an insider. And when he does that, it starts to invoke the ire of people who formerly supported him. And for King, it's a host of other issues, of course, but I can't help but see between that era with which I'm far more familiar and this era of civil rights, there are a number of comparisons there. And that's a huge one, Jake, is a lot of people who laud and celebrate Martin Luther King Day today, or Frederick Douglass during Black History Month. Were we in that moment, they probably would have been opposing many of the measures that these sort of figures supported. Yeah, so certainly I agree. And one thing I learned, I'll just say this as a parting note, that I was really interesting to me, and it's going to be my trivia fact of the next month to anybody I talk to, is we think of the "I Have a Dream" speech and call it that, but the "I Have a Dream" portion of it, of course, is sort of off the cuff. It's when someone shouts, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Do either of you know the original name, what he called the "I Have a Dream" speech before the "I Have a Dream" line became how it was best known? It was called "Normalcy, Never Again" was the name of the speech. "Normalcy, comma, never again" was the name of the speech. Not as catchy as "I Have a Dream."
No. Nope. All right. So I'm going to jump into my postscript, which I'll do quite quickly here. I had the opportunity recently, the end of November, early December, to travel to France for the first time. Went to the city of Paris, went to Alsace in eastern France as well, did some Christmas markets, saw Strasbourg, went to many museums. And I have to say, my postscript is, I never expected to love France as much as I loved France.
Oh no, you're a Francophile now, aren't you?
I am in Duolingo. I am like ready for my next trip. We're getting there. I have to say, I really, really enjoyed the trip. The history, the unintended historical theme of the trip was the Franco-Prussian War. So I'm a 19th century historian through and through. And the Paris Commune in 1871, which is really a bellwether for military, social, and political conflict in the 20th century that you see in a bloody 2-month span in the city of Paris. That, shockingly to me, I had no idea about this, that most of the neighborhoods of kind of the oldest parts of Paris were devastated during a week-long civil war in the end of the Paris Commune in May of 1871, which many of Paris's most famous landmarks were burned to the ground or bombed and blown up. And 25,000 Parisians die in the course of what's called Bloody Week in Paris. And the legacy and ramifications of this they still run through French politics, especially the politics of the left. of which the Paris Commune, which is a forerunner to it's called the Commune, and they were called communards. It's kind of a forerunner to communism that you'll see, and the Commune itself inspires Vladimir Lenin, the legacies and the lessons learned by the Paris Commune. And it's a fascinating piece of French history, which I had no idea about. I had heard of, maybe knew a little pieces of, but it really became kind of a theme that ran through our trip because many of the landmarks in Paris were altered. The Tuileries Palace, which was, part attached to the Louvre, was burned down as part of the fighting that took place in May of 1871. And so it's this kind of etched onto the landmarks of Paris. It's etched onto the landscape there. And just the whole visit makes me want to go back and dive in and learn more.
Just going to be eating, you get a beret and going to eat some baguettes. And I feel like you're just going to run around and they'll tell me that, the Franco-Prussian War is cooler than the American Civil War.
Well, I did find some figures. There are quite a bit of there's some overlap that goes. There's some Sherman overlapping. There is, and of course the name is now escaping me, but the minister from the United States, from Grant's government, to France, is stuck in Paris during the siege of Paris by the Prussians in much of 1870, in which many hundreds and thousands of Parisians die of starvation, and then is also a witness to and is one of the best sources for English language sources for the Paris Commune itself and the fighting that takes place. But there's also some French military officers that participated in the Civil War or observed the American Civil War that play a direct role in the Paris Commune, but on both sides. So it does have a connection back to the American Civil War as well. Always finding those connections.
And to come full circle on our entire conversation, you found a shocking number of early 2000 NASCAR jackets in French thrift stores.
No way. Wait a second. No.
Yes.
Jake, tell me you got one of them. Those are probably.
I did not. They were too highly priced for me.
Wow.
So for those of you that may have been maybe listening to this is one of the first episodes you're listening to. You have 3 NASCAR fans here. So there's the occasional NASCAR reference in this podcast as well. But yes, a shocking number of 1990s and early 2000s pieces of NASCAR memorabilia and clothing that I saw, including some cases walking around like the Bastille neighborhood of Paris. It's just like, oh yes, there goes a Chase Elliott jacket, which was kind of a strange experience. Also, thank you, Justin. Dropped into the to our little chat here that it was how do you say his first name is?
So that's hilarious that you say that because I only sent it to you because I didn't want to pronounce his name wrong.
Elihu, is it Elihu? Elihu Washburn?
Yeah,
he's the minister to France. Who's there?
I'm almost positive it's Elihu. That's how I've usually heard it pronounced.
There you go.
That's
Elihu
hysterical.
Washburn.
That's hysterical.
All right. Well, Codie, that ends our time with you. Thank you so much for chatting with us. It's been a great conversation and looking forward to chatting more in the future.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. Thank you guys. Yeah, really look forward to chatting again.
Thank you all so much for tuning in for this episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. A reminder, if you're enjoying the show, then take a quick 15 seconds to give us a thumbs up on YouTube or rate and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. You'll be doing us a solid by helping other listeners to find the show. We'll talk to you again soon.